The day I turned 18, my parents hit me with a $2,000 rent bill, while my lazy brother lived for free. I felt betrayed, but I didn't beg. I worked hard, saved every penny, and bought my own house. Then 6 months later, guess who came knocking? Homeless, desperate, and expecting my help. I smiled, letting them in, playing the perfect daughter. But the next morning, when they read the letter I left for them, their world shattered. They never saw it coming. And that was just the beginning. I remember the day everything changed for me. It wasn't a dramatic event, no explosion, no earth-shattering revelation. It was just a simple piece of paper, a bill, to be exact, handed to me by my own parents on my 18th birthday. I had just come downstairs, expecting maybe a small cake, maybe a happy birthday from my mom, Diane, or even a half-hearted nod from my dad, Mark. But instead, they sat me down at the kitchen table, placed an envelope in front of me, and told me I needed to start paying rent. $2,000. Due at the start of next month. I blinked, thinking it was a joke. Wait, what? I laughed nervously, looking between them. You're serious? We can't afford to keep taking care of you for free, Sophie, my dad said, his voice as cold as ever. You're an adult now. It's time you pull your weight. My mom just sat there, nodding along like she always did, never questioning him, never defending me. And my brother, Jake? He was nowhere in sight, probably asleep in his room after staying up all night playing video games. I pointed toward the stairs. What about Jake? I asked, my voice shaking. He doesn't pay anything. My dad frowned, as if I had just asked a stupid question. Jake is still young, he said. You're an adult now. It's different. Different?
How?
He was 2 years younger than me. He ate the same food, used the same electricity, lived under the same roof. But I was the one who had to pay. I wanted to argue, to scream at them for being so unfair, but I knew it wouldn't matter. My father had never cared about fairness when it came to me. My mother had never stood up for me. And Jake? He had never once had to worry about anything in his entire life. I had no choice but to obey. I got a job immediately, juggling long hours at a coffee shop while taking college classes. My day started at 5 a.m. and ended well past midnight. I barely slept, barely ate, and the money I made?
Most of it went to my parents.
And what did I get in return? Strict curfews, endless chores, and constant criticism. I had to clean up after my brother, cook dinner for the family, and follow a long list of house rules that seemed to exist only for me. If I ever complained, I was met with the same response. If you don't like it, move out. But how could I? I had nowhere to go. Every night, I watched as Jake came and went as he pleased, spent money on expensive sneakers, played video games until dawn, all while I was killing myself just to survive. I hated it. I hated them. But I swallowed it. I buried the anger deep inside. Because I knew one thing for sure, I wouldn't be here forever. I saved every penny I could, sometimes skipping meals just to put extra money aside. I studied harder than ever, determined to get a job that paid well enough to get me out. I refused to let them break me. And finally, at 24 years old, I did it. I bought my own house. I still remember the day I moved out. My dad barely looked up from the TV. My mom gave me a sad smile, but she didn't say much. And Jake? He laughed, making some stupid joke about how he'd finally have the whole upstairs to himself. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for them to be proud of me. I just walked out that door and never looked back. For the first time in my life, I was free. My house wasn't huge, but it was mine. Every room, every wall, every quiet moment of peace, it belonged to me. No rules, no curfews, no endless chores for people who never appreciated me. I could breathe. 6 months passed, and in that time, I built a life for myself. I worked as a financial analyst, finally earning the kind of money that allowed me to live comfortably. I made friends. I came home to silence, to peace, to a place that was warm and welcoming because I made it that way. Then, one evening, everything took a turn. I was making dinner when I heard a knock at the door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart raced, and for a second, I considered ignoring it. but curiosity won. I opened the door, and there they were. My parents. Mark and Diane stood on my porch, looking tired and defeated. Their clothes were wrinkled, their expressions uneasy. I folded my arms, raising an eyebrow.
Mom? Dad?
My mother forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Hi, sweetheart. Can we come in?" I hesitated for a long moment before stepping aside. "Sure," I said, my voice unreadable. They walked inside, looking around as if trying to memorize the details of my home. It was strange, seeing them standing here, in a space that had nothing to do with them. After an awkward silence, my father cleared his throat. "Listen, Sophie," he began, his voice unusually careful. "We need to talk." I leaned against the counter, arms still crossed. "Okay, talk." My mother sighed, wringing her hands. "Things haven't been easy for us lately," she admitted. "The business, well, it didn't work out. We lost a lot of money. And with Jake still living at home, it's been difficult."
Ah.
There it was. They weren't here to check on me. They weren't here because they suddenly cared. They were here because they needed something. "We need a place to stay," my dad finally said. "Just for a little while. Until we get back on our feet." I stared at them, letting their words sink in. The same people who had forced me to pay rent at 18. The same people who favored my brother over me. The same people who had made my life miserable. And now, they needed me. For a moment, I considered kicking them out right then and there. But then an idea formed in my mind. I smiled. I smiled because I knew exactly what I was going to do. I stepped forward and placed a hand on my mom's shoulder. "Of course, you can stay," I said sweetly. "Your family." Their faces lit up with relief, and for a second, they actually believed I was still the same naive daughter they had controlled for years. They had no idea what was coming. I was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The night my parents moved in, I could feel the shift in power. It was subtle at first, but I knew the moment they stepped inside my home that everything had changed. They needed me now. I showed them to the guest room, the smallest one in the house. My mother looked around hesitantly, and my father, so used to being the one in control, gave a tight nod, clearly expecting something better. "Is this the only room?" he asked, glancing at me. I shrugged. "It's what I have available." It wasn't a lie. It was exactly what they deserved. They didn't argue. Not yet, but I could see the tension in their eyes. I smiled to myself and let them settle in. I knew it wouldn't take long before the real complaints started. The first night, my mother tried to be gentle about it. "Sophie, dear," she said after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with a forced smile. "We were thinking since we'll be staying here for a while, maybe we could move into one of the bigger rooms? Just so we're more comfortable." I looked at her for a moment before shaking my head. "Oh, I wish I could, Mom. But those rooms are already set up for other things. You know, my home office, my gym. I really don't have any extra space." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't push it. Not yet. I watched as they slowly realized that they weren't in charge anymore. They were guests in my house now, and I was about to make sure they never forgot it. The next morning, I handed them a piece of paper over breakfast. My mother took it, smiling at first, until she read the words. It was a rental agreement. My father frowned. "What is this?" I took a sip of my coffee, acting as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "A lease. Just a few basic rules. You know, to keep things fair." My mother's face paled. "Fair," she whispered. I nodded. "Yes. You charged me $2,000 a month when I turned 18. So, of course, I'm just following the same rule." Silence. The only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the wall clock. My father's eyes darkened. "Sophie, this is ridiculous." "Is it?" I tilted my head. "You always said that paying rent was part of being an adult. I mean, you wouldn't want to set a bad example for Jake, right?" My mother opened her mouth, probably to plead with me, but I cut her off. "And don't worry about feeling like a guest. I made sure to include house rules too, just like the ones you gave me." I smiled. Strict curfew at 9 p.m. Daily chores, You'll both be responsible for cleaning the kitchen, bathrooms, and yard. Oh, and of course, no unnecessary electricity use. My father's hands clenched into fists. You can't be serious. I shrugged. If I could do it, so can you. My mother looked like she was about to cry. Sweetheart, we're your parents. I gave her a cold stare. And I was your daughter. Did that stop you from charging me rent? From treating me like a burden? She had no answer. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I didn't feel guilty. Not for a second. They had never cared about how their rules affected me. They had never felt bad when I worked myself to exhaustion just to keep up with their demands. Now it was their turn. Fine. My father finally muttered, grabbing the contract. We'll sign it. I almost laughed. He thought this was the worst of it. But I wasn't done. That week, they struggled. My father, so used to barking orders, now had to scrub floors. My mother, who had never lifted a finger for chores, had to cook dinner every night. And the curfew? That was my favorite part. The first time my father came home at 9:05 p.m., I was already waiting at the door. I shook my head.
Sorry, Dad.
House rules. Doors lock at 9 p.m. His face turned red. This is insane. I smiled sweetly. I don't make the rules. I leaned in just a little. Oh, wait. I do. He banged on the door for 10 minutes before storming off to sleep in his car. By the end of the first week, they were exhausted. By the second week, they started breaking. One night, my mother came to me, her eyes pleading. Sophie, please. We can't do this anymore. Can't you let us stay just as family? Family? They hadn't treated me like family for years. I shook my head. You always taught me that nothing in life is free, I said quietly. I'm just following your rules. She broke down crying. My father, too proud to beg, just sat there silently stewing. But I knew what they were really thinking. They regretted everything. And that was exactly what I wanted. By the third week, the cracks in their pride had fully shattered. The same parents who once controlled every aspect of my life were now trapped under the weight of their own rules. They dragged themselves through the days, following the same suffocating restrictions they had once forced onto me without a second thought. I could see it in their eyes, the frustration, the exhaustion, the realization that I was no longer the weak, powerless girl they had once dictated. They were breaking, piece by piece, and I wasn't going to stop it. My father, once a proud, dominating force in our household, now looked smaller somehow. Every night, when he thought I wasn't watching, I'd catch him rubbing his temples, sighing deeply, as if the weight of everything was finally pressing down on him. My mother? She had stopped trying to talk to me, stopped trying to convince me to change the rules. She knew it was useless. But Jake? That was the final straw. One night, just before curfew, the doorbell rang. I checked the clock. 8:57 p.m. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Jake stood there, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. His usual expensive sneakers, a brand new hoodie, and his car keys twirling between his fingers. Hey, Soph, he greeted casually, stepping inside like he owned the place. Mom and Dad here? I crossed my arms. Yeah, they are. But you're not staying here. He blinked at me, confused. What? Come on, I just came to chill. You got extra rooms, right? He looked around, clearly impressed.
Damn, sis.
You really made it out, huh? He laughed. Guess we all benefit from that now. I didn't laugh. I didn't smile. I just stared at him. For years, Jake had been the one who had everything handed to him, the one who had watched me suffer under our parents' rules without ever lifting a finger to help. And now he thought he could just walk in here like none of it mattered? Jake, this isn't your house, I said, my voice cold. You don't live here.
He scoffed.
Okay?
So?
It's Mom and Dad's place now, right? My mother walked into the room at that moment, her face tired and worn, but when she saw Jake, she lit up like she always did.
Jake.
Oh, sweetheart, come sit. I'll make you something to eat. I clenched my jaw. Of course. Even now, after everything, she still treated him like the golden child. No, I said firmly, making them both turn to me. Jake isn't staying here. He doesn't live here. He doesn't pay rent. Jake laughed, thinking I was joking. Oh, come on, sophomore. You're not serious, right? I met his eyes. Dead serious. My father entered the room now, already annoyed. Sophie, enough of this, he said, rubbing his forehead. Jake is family. He has every right to be here. I stared at him, then at my mother. Oh, so family matters now? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Because when I was struggling, family sure didn't seem to matter. Or did you forget that I was forced to pay $2,000 a month to live in my own home while Jake sat around doing nothing? A tense silence fell over the room. Jake rolled his eyes. Jesus, you're still mad about that? You really need to let that go. Let it go. Let it go. I felt the years of bitterness, anger, betrayal bubbling up in my chest, but I kept my voice calm.
Steady.
Cold. I already let it go, I said smoothly. That's why I left. That's why I built a life for myself.
But you?
You're still expecting handouts. And I don't owe you anything. Jake looked at our parents. You're seriously gonna let her do this? My father clenched his fists. My mother looked pleadingly at me. Sweetheart, she tried again. It's just for a little while. No, I interrupted. It's not. Jake doesn't get to walk in here and live for free. If he wants to stay, he can sign the lease. $2,000 a month, just like I paid. Jake's face twisted with disgust. Are you insane? He scoffed. I'm not paying you rent. That's ridiculous. I raised an eyebrow. Funny. That's exactly what I said when you all did it to me. He turned to our parents, expecting them to defend him. But this time they didn't. My father's face was red with anger, but he knew he had no power over me anymore. My mother looked like she wanted to beg, but what could she say? They had set the rules first, and now they were learning what it felt like. Jake muttered something under his breath and turned toward the door. Whatever.
Screw this.
I'll just stay with my friends. My mother watched him leave, her eyes filled with worry. She probably wanted to run after him, to take care of him like she always had. But she couldn't, because she didn't have a home of her own anymore. For the first time in her life, she had nowhere else to go. I didn't miss the way my father tensed, the way his pride cracked just a little more as he realized his precious son had abandoned them the second things got difficult. Jake had never struggled a day in his life, and the moment it was time for him to take responsibility, he ran. I almost laughed, because now they finally understood. I turned to my parents, my voice emotionless. If you want to leave too, go ahead. I won't stop you. My mother looked down, her shoulders slumped in defeat. My father said nothing, because they had no options left. They had burned every bridge they had. And now, they were trapped in the very life they once forced onto me. The days dragged on, and I watched as my parents became shadows of the people they once were. My father, once so loud and commanding, barely spoke anymore. My mother, who had spent her life catering to Jake, now sat quietly at the table every morning, staring at her coffee like it might give her an answer she didn't want to hear. They had nothing left. Jake had disappeared after that night, making no effort to check on them. My mother must have called him dozens of times, but he never answered. Maybe it was because he didn't care. Or maybe he just didn't want to be burdened the way I had been. Either way, it didn't matter. The people who had spent years treating me like I didn't belong in my own home were now learning what it felt like to be outsiders. I could tell they were counting down the days, waiting for me to change my mind, to offer them kindness like they had never offered me.
But I wasn't going to.
I had given them exactly what they deserved. Then, one evening, after another silent dinner, my mother finally spoke. Sophie. I looked up from my plate. Yeah. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. I could already tell what she was about to say. We can't stay here, she whispered, her voice shaking. Not like this. My father exhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. I set my fork down, waiting for her to continue. I know we weren't good to you, she admitted. I know we Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. We made mistakes. But we're your parents. I nodded slowly. You are. And you're our daughter, she said quickly, desperately, as if that alone should be enough to fix everything. We raised you. We took care of you. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Did you? Silence. My mother blinked rapidly, looking lost for words. My father just stared at the table. When I turned 18, I said calmly, "Did you care that I had to work 2 jobs just to keep up with the rent you charged me? Did you ever think about how exhausting it was to study all night and then wake up at dawn just to make money for a house I wasn't even welcome in?" Sophie, my mother whispered, but I kept going. Did you ever stop and ask yourselves why you treated me like a tenant, but Jake like a prince? Did you ever wonder how it felt to watch him get everything for free while I had to earn every scrap of respect in that house? My father finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, defeated.
He didn't argue.
He didn't yell, because he knew there was nothing left to say. We didn't think. My mother started, but I cut her off.
No.
You didn't. Another silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then finally my mother sighed. We'll leave tomorrow. A small part of me expected her to beg again, to try one last time to make me forgive and forget. But she didn't, because she knew this was over. I nodded. I'll have your last rent payment ready in the morning. My father flinched at the mention of money, but neither of them argued. They knew they had no right to ask for mercy. The next morning, they packed their things. They didn't ask where they were going next. They didn't tell me what their plan was. And honestly, I didn't care. When they stepped onto the porch, my mother turned one last time. I hope one day you can forgive us, she said softly. I met her eyes, my expression unreadable. Maybe, I said. She nodded sadly, as if that was the best answer she was going to get. Then, without another word, they walked away. I stood in the doorway, watching as my parents, the people who had once held all the power in my life, disappeared down the street with nothing. And I felt nothing for them. No guilt, no sadness, no regret, just relief. I closed the door behind me and exhaled, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I was free.